Hi there again, folks. Martin Lane here from Orange Technology, and today I want to talk to you guys about the cloud. The cloud. So before I start, if you guys are new to me and don't know me at all, my name is Martin. I live in Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory, so that's in northern Canada. For those of you who want to visualize it geographically, we're right next to Alaska, so we're on the Canadian side of Alaska, basically. And so we're pretty far north. I mean, I live in a city of about 30,000 people. It's just shy of 30,000. It is a capital city, so we have all of our services here. And I run Orange Technology, which is an IT services provider. It's for those of you watching from the US, it's kind of the managed service provider model. Up here in Canada, we don't really use the term MSP that much. So we're, essentially an IT services provider. We administer networks. We put in, we work on desktop servers, network switches, routers, IP phone systems, all that kind of stuff. So we're kind of your one-stop technology shop. And there's been a lot of talk about the cloud and cloud services and cloud computing and everything related to the cloud, essentially. There's within the industry there's a lot of assumptions, and there's a lot of people who are on either side of the fence. There's some people that say, the cloud is just a fad. It's not going to exist for that long. And there's the other side of the fence that says, hey, everything is going to be cloud. The cloud is here. It is the future, and so forth. I'm taking a little bit of the medium or the middle of the road on this debate or topic. I would say that I would firmly say the cloud is here. The cloud is not the future. It's not something that's coming up. The cloud is here right now. For those people that don't think that's the case, I mean, you've got Amazon Web Services, you've got Microsoft Azure for infrastructure, you've got those two are the main platforms, and then of course you have all the software as a service. I mean, everything from Salesforce to Autotask is a big IT management one. Those are kind of the ones for the IT sector, for sales or things like that. But there's lots. I mean, everything from accounting. You have QuickBooks Online now. Sage One is an online accounting system. I'm just trying to think of other ones. I mean, anything where basically you log onto a website and you manage things. Project management. There's one that a lot of Mac users like. It's for project tracking and management and input. It's called Basecamp. That's what it is. So there's all these services, all these software as a service, SaaS models. That's all cloud computing. I mean, that's all in the cloud. So that is here. That is here. That is now. You are using it. And I think anybody that says that doesn't exist or it's not being used right now, I don't think that's true. I think they're living in the past. I think they, for whatever reason, don't want to accept that is going on right now. So that's the first thing. The next question is that I see in this discussion is how much is in the cloud versus how little. So there are certain things that certainly can and should be in the cloud. For those people that do development, software development, or web development or anything like that, absolutely the cloud is a place to have your sandboxes, your testing, all of that, all of your development work. Backups, cloud backups are especially something that is a market that will grow, that has already grown, quite honestly, but will continue to grow and become large. And that is because, it just makes sense. I mean, most people have local backups, but what happens if there's a fire, a flood, theft, vandalism, hurricane, natural disaster of any kind? Your backups are gone if they're physically in the same place as your servers or file storage or whatever you've got. So cloud backup, where you physically have your data somewhere else in a secure location, makes a lot of sense, right? a lot of my clients are using cloud backup right now. And so this segues into a different part of this discussion. So leave that for a second. So like I said, the cloud is here. It's already here. It's being used. Anyone who's not taking advantage of it, I think, is behind the times. I think there should be adoption of the cloud where it makes sense. Some things don't make sense to have in the cloud. Most of my clients do have an on-premise server. I mean, do you put your Active Directory into the cloud? Do you put your primary file storage into the cloud? That is something you have to weigh out. Storage, I mean, essentially the cloud is based on one particular model, and that's you pay for usage. Whether that's usage of a virtual machine that's running, so your virtual machine time, your on time they call it, storage space, computing power, all of that is really built on a pay per usage model. So I mean, if you have, I don't know, a terabyte or two of local data that you want to access and have to use regularly, maybe that still makes sense to have on premise. So by all means, I'm not saying that the cloud is for everything and it makes sense in every single scenario. I actually firmly believe in a hybrid model. I believe in having some things in the cloud and having some things on premise, especially where it makes financial sense. A lot of times when you're talking about large storage and things like that, it actually winds up being cheaper to purchase the on-premise solution and have it on-premise because by the time you've amortized that into the same cost as your monthly cost, have it in the cloud, honestly, the appliance or the hardware will still be useful, and you will actually wind up spending less money if you have it on premise. So I think there's a total cost of ownership model that has to be looked at there, and has to be evaluated correctly, and yeah. So I'm a firm believer of the hybrid model where you have some things in the cloud, some things on premise. Now, something that is often overlooked by technology professionals is the regulatory environment. For those of you in the U.S., you don't really have to think about this as much. Most of the cloud services that exist on the planet are hosted in the U.S. I don't have an exact number, but I would bet it's about 80% probably of cloud services that exist on the planet are hosted in the U.S. And I mean, there's a variety of reasons for that. Most of the cloud infrastructure is in the U.S. Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, they're based in the U.S. Google, of course, I forgot to mention them. They're based in the U.S. Everything's based in the U.S. So the U.S. is also one of the largest markets. I mean, I want to say 380 million people live in the U.S., something around that. It's a very large market. It just makes sense, right? I mean, everything is basically housed in the U.S. So for those of you in the U.S., you don't really have to worry so much about the regulatory environment because where your data is being kept and where these companies are offering these services is already in your jurisdiction. So most of what you're seeing already conforms to your own laws. Makes sense, right? The problem we have, so I'm in Canada, so I'm north of the U.S. I'm in the U.S.'s neighbor, just up north, but our regulatory environment is much different and much more complex than what you guys have in the U.S., particularly with how things pertain to personal information, personal storage of data. So we have, for example, one piece of legislation called PIPEDA, P-I-P-E-D-A, the Personal Information and Protection of Electronic Documents Act. It's a really long name, I know. Why couldn't they make it any shorter? I really don't know. But anyways, PIPEDA. So PIPEDA has very specific regulations and guidelines and rules around how you store and how you protect personal information that you collect from others. So this would be names, birth dates, addresses, phone numbers, credit card information is actually governed by a few other acts, but credit card information, social insurance numbers, credit reports, any of that kind of stuff, anything like that. So if you're in the private sector, you are governed under PIPEDA, and there are rules on how you keep and store that information. What's interesting is if, for example, you have Dropbox, let's say you use Dropbox. Dropbox is a great service. I mean, I use it personally for a few personal things. I like it, works, it's easy. So you're using that and you put some information in there. Let's say you put, I don't know, an Excel sheet as part of your HR. You've got employee, you've got this Excel sheet, you've got all the raises they've gotten, how many hours they've done, how much they've been paid, that kind of stuff. So let's say you've got that in there and you put that in Dropbox. That is now housed, physically, that data is housed in the United States of America. Now, because of certain American regulations, particularly the Patriot Act allows American authorities access to the data without a warrant. Essentially, there's a few other bits and pieces in there, but essentially it allows American authorities access to the data without a warrant. That violates your obligations under PIPEDA here in Canada. So this is one of those things where you have a big, huge gray area because of jurisdiction. You've put the data into the U.S. Because it's in the U.S., American authorities can access that data, and they haven't violated any of their own laws. The data's in the U.S., the Americans are accessing it based on their legislation and their regulations that they have. They're allowed to, they do it. But because of that, you as the owner of the data here in Canada have now violated Canadian law because somebody has accessed that information. And the people who have accessed that information are not recognized as authorities under Canadian law. They are authorities in U.S. law. I mean, FBI, local police, whatever, the IRS, whomever. But that is not, those entities, those agencies are not recognized as law enforcement or regulatory bodies like they are here in Canada. For example, here in Canada, in the U.S. you have the IRS. Here in Canada we have the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency. They function the same. They have the same function. I mean, they're the tax agency. They're responsible for collecting taxes and all this stuff. But here in Canada, if any legislation or regulations talk about the CRA and the tax authorities, or specifically the tax authorities' authority to look at data or investigate things, it's the Canada Revenue Agency. It's not the IRS. The IRS is not recognized as the tax authority, even though they are a tax authority in the U.S. But the problem is if you house your data in the U.S., now those agencies, because it's in the U.S., those agencies, by American law, have a right to access and look at the data. So that's where you get into that problem. It used to be a very, very gray area in recent years. Information and privacy commissioners, both federally and on the provincial and territorial levels, have made clear lines in the sand. Like, no, you are the owner of the information. It is your responsibility to ensure it is kept safe and it is kept in an area that falls under our jurisdiction. If you house the data in the U.S. and it is accessed by American authorities or anybody else, you are responsible for that breach of privacy and confidentiality, and that's just how it is. So for us here in Canada, it's when I look at hybrid cloud or I say maybe cloud is not the right thing for this. It's not necessarily because I don't believe in the technology. It's not an IT problem. It is not, it is not even a belief of, is this secure? Are there firewalls here? It's not even that. It's a regulatory concern. And that is something that a lot of people are not thinking about is, recommending these solutions or adopting these solutions. Do they allow you to conform to the laws, regulations, and legislation that exists in your area right now at this time? And that's the problem with a lot of cloud services for us here in Canada, is we cannot use them because we have a regulatory obligation to fulfill all these acts. I mean, another act we have here locally, actually here in the Yukon, we're about to enact it, is called HIPAA. the Health Information Protection and Privacy Management Act. Again, really long. Don't know why it's got to be that long. Anyways, so this act, it kind of does the same thing. It outlines how you're responsible for patient information, for people's medical information. It even outlines rules and regulations, or I shouldn't say specific rules and regulations, but guidelines on. No, that's not right either. I mean, it is a rule and regulation, but basically they have stipulations on who can access such information. So, for example, you have a medical clinic, let's say, okay, and you have a patient who comes and sees a doctor, and the doctor puts notes into what's called an EMR, an electronic medical records system. Okay, so the doctor, the physician, puts these notes into the EMR. I saw this patient. This was their problem. Blah blah blah. The medical clinic is now the custodian of that information. So it's actually written in the act. They use the term of reference of custodian. So the medical clinic is now the custodian of that information. Now, everybody who works at the medical clinic, the physician included, they are now agents of the custodian. Now, breaking it down even further, you have to look at, okay, so you have this information, you have these notes from the doctor's visit, whatever. Now you have to separate who has access to that information in terms of agents within the medical clinic, so staff. So, for example, you have a physician and you have an MOA. MOA stands for medical office assistant. So these are the folks up front that greet you, that do that make the appointments, and all of that. They do the referrals. They send the request for blood tests and lab stuff out to the hospital and things like that. So one of the question is, so these MOAs, they have access to the EMR system, the electronic medical record system, of course, because they need to make appointments and schedule things, and they need to request lab tests and things like that. Do the MOAs need to see the physician's notes on the checkup or the appointment they had with the patient? Right? And that's something to think about, right? Right now, in a lot of places, the MOAs do. They can just see the notes. But with the regulations the way they are, they want the information compartmentalized, so that basically it's a need to know. So the MOAs can see scheduling, they're able to requisition tests, they're able to see referral status, but do those MOAs need to be able to see the physician's notes on the appointment? In many cases, not, right? And that's a privacy thing, right? You have an appointment with your doctor. Your doctor tells you whatever, or checks up on you or whatever. They make those notes within the EMR system, and then, right, and that's between you and your doctor. The MOA doesn't need to know what happened within that appointment, what your doctor said or what he suggested. They don't need necessarily to know that in order to make another appointment for you, right? So that's one of those things you have to look at. That's HIPAA. We also have something called ATIP, so the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, and that governs. PIPEDA is for the private sector. ATIP is for the public sector, so government, so how governments deal with your information. So, for example, when the Department of Motor Vehicles has your driver's license information, should somebody from the Department of Health be able to access that? And if they need to or they have to for some reason, how does that take place? What are the safeguards? All of that kind of stuff. So, those are three pieces of legislation, three major ones that I listed, but there are a lot more. There's a lot more out there. When I talk about cloud services, this is what I'm talking about. You have to look at all of these regulations and all these pieces of legislation. You have to understand how they affect the data you are storing, especially if that data is something like health information or even financial information. Financial information is governed by, a series of other acts. How you deal with credit histories, SIN numbers, collections, things like that. That's completely different. So there's a couple things when it comes to credit card info, things like that. PCI compliance, that's the payment card industry. They have specific rules and regulations on how you keep financial information, credit card numbers, that kind of thing. You can't just, you're not allowed to just, if you have a client who always wants to pay by credit card and they just say, bill me every month, no problem, keep my card number. You actually can't just write that card number down on a sticky and have it in your office. You're not allowed to put that card number in Notepad and then save it on your desktop. You're actually not allowed to do that. The rules prevent you from that. That also goes into your merchant agreements. If you're able to process a credit card, you have a merchant provider. So that's, if you have a POS machine where you swipe things or stick the chip in or your key numbers in, you have an agreement for that. And it specifically states in there what you are and are not allowed to keep when it comes to things like credit card info and things like that. So there's a lot of legislation and regulatory requirements out there that you have to meet, especially when it comes to things like cloud computing and where your data is hosted. I'll give you one example. I mean, when we were looking some time ago, even several years ago, we were looking at cloud backup for our clients. And at that time, really the only good cloud backup providers were in the US. And we simply couldn't do it. The regulatory requirements and the potential for regulatory infringement, for breaking regulatory requirements, was just too high. One of the things I would have required if we were considering putting data into the US, for example, or anywhere outside of our borders, this could be even in Europe, for example, is an information manager agreement. And none of the basic information manager agreement outlines from the provider's end. So in this case, the cloud backup provider's end, the information manager agreement outlines their processes, who has access to that data, what the chain of command is, what the auditing trail looks like, and all those kind of things. When I was looking at it, and I asked these providers, would you sign an information manager agreement? Basically, they told me to go stuff it. Understanding I'm probably a pretty small client. My city's 30,000 people. I don't have 5,000 clients that each have a terabyte of data to send. So I'm not a huge fish by any means. And I think the onus of this information manager agreement was just going to be too much, because these large providers would probably have to involve their lawyers to look at it and all of that, right? So they weren't interested. So we basically couldn't do this several years ago. Just recently, there are now two major providers here in Canada that offer cloud backup services. We signed an agreement with one of them. They're actually in Ontario, in the province of Ontario. Literally, just so you know, this is literally about a 2-hour drive from border town in New York, from Buffalo. It's about a 2-hour drive straight from Buffalo. This is not geographically that far away, but because it crosses our border, it's now in Canada. I honestly don't think they're doing anything special in terms of how they're storing the data, or they're doing anything new or crazy within the industry that nobody else is doing. I don't think there's any kind of crazy innovation there. It's just from a regulatory perspective there in Canada, they conform to Canadian regulations. They have no problem with information manager agreements. They already have a template for it. Everything's already there. And that's because they understand what the rules are for doing business here in Canada and how they have to act. So we struck a partnership with them. I now have the majority of Orange's clients on the cloud backup. It's working great. I've got, there's very few problems. I've got an account manager, it's easy to get hold of, all that fun stuff. But basically, I had to wait until that was available here in Canada. Now, as cloud grows, will our regulations grow? I believe they will, and quite frankly, I believe they will be more restrictive. Unfortunately, it's my opinion that the majority of legislators are not necessarily lawyers. They're not IT people. when these things get drafted up, there are a lot of considerations that aren't taken into account. There are a lot of quite frankly, they would probably benefit from increased consultation with the industry to get an understanding of what we need and what we're looking at and what's possible and what's not, and what might be a pain point and all that kind of thing. I personally don't think there's enough of that. It's just my opinion. But as the cloud grows, I firmly believe the regulations will grow. They will not shrink. That's just my opinion. So we will be faced with more of a regulatory environment, especially as we see increases in hacks and data breaches. The Target hack, the Sony hack. I mean, these are high-profile breaches. A lot of data gets lost, and when that happens, the first thing that regulators do, the elected officials, is they go, "Okay, we have to create new regulations to make sure this never happens again." And the bottom line is, it probably will happen again. I actually think we'll see more and more of it as more information is kept electronically, as more things are connected, as the cloud grows. I think we'll see actually more of them. I don't think you can simply just legislate it and it'll stop. Again, that's just my opinion. But so, I mean, really from an IT perspective, it's funny because I tell all the clients, this isn't a problem of IT. It's actually quite simple to do from an IT perspective. This is a regulatory problem, and this is something we have to look at from a regulatory perspective. Quite frankly, there are many days when I'm dealing with solutions and trying to evaluate things and this and that, where quite frankly, I'm not acting like an IT tech. I'm acting like a lawyer. Right? Like, will my client get sued if they use this service? Will someone sue them because they put this information somewhere they shouldn't have, and they should have known better, right? And it's it's kind of funny. I mean, I don't hate lawyers. Lawyers get paid very well. Let me tell you, lawyers get paid very well. But honestly, like I feel like I'm a lawyer more than I am an IT person, especially when I'm dealing with cloud solutions. And that's really something to think about. That's something you really have to think about if you're in the industry of IT or technology on a whole. Is you have to be thinking about these regulatory things, about legislation. It's not just about which Windows server do I buy, or do I use Azure, or do I use Amazon Web Services? Which one am I going to pick? You really have to think about everything outside of that. You have to think about the business environment, the regulatory environment, how that all works. So it's not just about the tech anymore. And that's just the reality. I mean, that's with the cloud comes that. When everything was on premise, the question of 8, 9, 10 years ago, whatever, when the cloud was just starting and just gaining traction, when everybody had racks and racks of servers and storage, the question of where's your data housed wasn't even a question. Nobody thought to ask that. Nobody thought to think about that, because, well, my data's right here. It's physically in front of me. Maybe I have a backup where I go to tape, or I go to external media or whatever. Where do I keep that, right? Maybe I keep that in a bank deposit box. I know some clients who have done that. Or maybe somebody takes it home, or I put it in a fireproof safe, or whatever, however you did that. But generally speaking, the data wasn't leaving your jurisdiction. Like, even if you brought it home, it wasn't like, oh, it's crossing into America every day back and forth, right? That's not the case. So, back then, really, when you were thinking about these things, where your data was kept was never really a question, because your data was always physically in front of you. Now, with all these cloud services, your data is wherever, right? It's in the US or it's in the UK. I mean, we had some clients who were doing cloud backup into the UK, right? And the UK actually has very strong privacy regulations. I would argue they are as good, if not better, than what we have here in Canada. That being said, there are still aspects of the regulations that are different than the ones we have here in Canada. So, we've since moved those clients. Those are newly acquired clients. We've moved them from doing backups into the cloud in the UK and bringing them here to doing it in the cloud here in Canada, because then it's all kept in Canada. no problems with regulatory or legislative concerns, anything like that. So yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about in this video. So yeah, really you've got to think. I would stress highly for anybody who's in the IT industry or getting into the industry that you really think about the broader aspects of all of this stuff that may not be directly IT related. Again, regulation, legislation, that has nothing to do with the physical server you're deploying. Is it a Dell? Is it an HP? Are you virtualizing? Are you not? It really has nothing to do with that whatsoever. This is the law on privacy of information and how you store it and everything around that. So really something to think about. Again, that's what I want to talk about in this video. It's quite frankly, I could talk for hours on this, so I will stop it there and let you guys think about that. And yeah, I'll see you at the next video.